What could drive a 16-year-old girl, the pretty, popular daughter of a beloved small-time pastor, to not just approve of a plan to murder her own family, but to hide outside and listen as her mother is nearly decapitated with a samurai sword and her young brothers are slaughtered in their beds, all for the sake of a boy she barely knew? In the quiet, rural community of Alba, Texas, the Caffey family was the very picture of devout, small-town life. Terry Caffey was the pastor of the Miracle Faith Baptist Church, a loving husband to his wife Penny, and a devoted father to their 3 children, 16-year-old Erin, 13-year-old Matthew, and 8-year-old Tyler. Erin was the quintessential pastor's daughter. She sang in the church choir, worked a part-time job at the local Sonic drive-in, and was, by all accounts, a sweet and obedient girl. But in late 2007, the darkness entered her life in the form of 19-year-old Charlie Wilkinson. He was her new boyfriend, a troubled young man with a history of instability, and Erin fell for him, hard and fast. Their parents, Terry and Penny, were immediately concerned. They saw Wilkinson's controlling nature and felt the relationship was moving too quickly and becoming too intense. They did what any concerned parent would do. They tried to intervene. After a few weeks of dating, they told Erin that she was too young for such a serious relationship and that she had to break up with him. To Erin, this was not parental guidance. It was a declaration of war. Furious and defiant, she was given a simple, heartbreaking ultimatum: Charlie or her family. She made her choice. In the weeks that followed, Erin and Charlie, along with 2 of Charlie's friends, 20-year-old Charles Wade and his 18-year-old girlfriend, Bobby Johnson, began to craft a plan. It was a plot so brutal and absolute, it defied all reason. The goal was not to run away together. It was to eliminate the obstacles. They decided to murder Erin's entire family, burn down their house, and split the insurance money, freeing Erin to be with Charlie forever. Erin, the pastor's daughter, provided her co-conspirators with detailed information about her family's schedule and the layout of their home. She was an active and willing participant in the planning of her own family's annihilation. In the pre-dawn hours of March 1st, 2008, the plan was put into motion. Erin and her accomplice, Bobby Johnson, waited outside in a getaway car, a chilling audience to the horror they had helped orchestrate. Inside the Parker-Hulme, the family was asleep. At around 3 a.m., Charlie Wilkinson and Charles Wade kicked in the door. They stormed into the master bedroom where Terry and Penny were sleeping and unleashed a hellish assault. Wilkinson stood over Penny Caffey and attacked her with a samurai sword, hacking at her with such ferocity that she was nearly decapitated. Wade, meanwhile, opened fire on Terry, shooting him multiple times in the face, back, and arms. As Terry drifted in and out of consciousness, bleeding profusely, he heard his daughter Erin's voice. She was standing in the doorway. When her boyfriend asked if her father was dead, Terry heard his daughter's chilling, 2-word reply: I don't know. Wilkinson then entered Terry's son's bedroom. He shot 13-year-old Matthew in the face before repeatedly stabbing him with the sword. Wade found 8-year-old Tyler hiding in a closet and stabbed him to death with a 6-inch dagger. After slaughtering the family, the 2 killers set the house on fire and fled, meeting up with Erin and Bobby in the waiting car. But in a true miracle, Terry Caffey was not dead. Fueled by an impossible surge of adrenaline, he managed to crawl and stumble through the smoke-filled burning house, making it over 300 yards to a neighbor's home. He was horrifically injured, with 5 gunshot wounds and severe burns. But he was alive, and he told the police everything. He identified his daughter's boyfriend as one of the attackers, and with that, the entire conspiracy unraveled within hours. All 4 were arrested that same day. The legal fallout was swift. To avoid the death penalty, Charlie Wilkinson and Charles Wade pleaded guilty and were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Bobby Johnson, who waited in the car, received a 40-year sentence. Erin Caffey, the girl at the center of the massacre, took a plea deal. In exchange for her testimony, she was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences, plus 25 years. But the most incredible chapter of this story is not one of evil, but of forgiveness. Erin Caffey, a man who lost his wife, his sons, and his home, and who was shot and left for dead on his daughter's command, made a decision that stunned the world. He chose to forgive her. From his hospital bed, he began a painful journey of physical and spiritual recovery, and one of his first acts was to visit Erin in prison. He walked into the visitation room, looked at the daughter who had taken everything from him, and told her that he loved her and that he forgave her. As of Wednesday, August 27, 2025, Erin Caffey is 33 years old and is incarcerated at the Christina Crane Unit in Gatesville, Texas. She will not be eligible for parole until she is 59 years old. Her father, Terry, has since remarried and become a public speaker, sharing his story of unthinkable loss and radical forgiveness. The case of Erin Caffey remains a haunting exploration of the dark places a teenage romance can go, and a powerful, almost unbelievable testament to a father's love that refused to be extinguished by the flames of hatred. At 12 years old, a girl's world should revolve around school, sleepovers, and the innocent dramas of middle school. But what if, behind the quiet face of a 7th grader, lies the cold heart of a killer? What if, fueled by a forbidden, illegal romance with a man who claims to be a 300-year-old werewolf, she decides the only way they can truly be together is to systematically slaughter her entire family in their beds? In the small, close-knit town of Medicine Hat, Alberta, Canada, the Richardson family, Mark, Deborah, and their 2 children, 12-year-old Jasmine and 8-year-old Jacob, were a normal, well-liked family. But in the spring of 2006, that idyllic picture was shattered when Jasmine began a secret and deeply disturbing relationship with 23-year-old Jeremy Steinke. Steinke was a troubled outcast with a gothic persona who frequented punk rock shows and harbored a dark fantasy life. He told his friends he was a werewolf, that he enjoyed the taste of blood, and he soon drew the young, impressionable Jasmine into his twisted world. Their relationship blossomed online on websites like vampirefreaks.com. They exchanged hundreds of messages, creating a shared fantasy where they were star-crossed lovers persecuted by a world that didn't understand them. When Jasmine's parents, Mark and Deborah, discovered the illegal relationship, they did what any responsible parent would do. They grounded their 12-year-old daughter and forbade her from seeing a 23-year-old man who is an obvious predator. To Jasmine and Jeremy, this was not an act of parental protection. It was a declaration of war. Their online chats took a sinister turn, escalating from teenage angst into a cold-blooded murder plot. Jeremy wrote to Jasmine, "I have this plan. It begins with me killing them and ends with me marrying you." Jasmine's chilling reply sealed her family's fate. It has to be done. On the night of April 23, 2006, their dark fantasy became a horrifying reality. Jeremy Steinke, high on cocaine and wearing a black trench coat, broke into the Richardson family home. He went to the master bedroom and brutally stabbed Mark and Deborah Richardson to death. But the horror was not his alone to commit. In an act of unthinkable depravity, 12-year-old Jasmine Richardson took part in the massacre. She went into the bedroom of her 8-year-old brother, Jacob. As the little boy screamed and begged for his life, his own sister plunged a knife into his chest and cut his throat. The following day, after the children failed to show up for school, a concerned neighbor discovered the bloodbath inside the Richardson home. The discovery sparked a massive manhunt for the missing Jasmine, who was initially believed to be another victim. But the truth quickly emerged from the couple's own digital trail. Police tracked them to a neighboring province, where they were arrested without incident just a day after the murders. When a friend who had given them a ride asked what happened, Jasmine reportedly giggled and said that her parents were dead. The case sent a shockwave of horror across Canada and the world. Due to her age, Jasmine Richardson became the youngest person in Canadian history to be charged with multiple counts of murder. Her identity was protected under youth justice laws at the time, and she was known to the public only as JR. Her trial revealed the chilling depth of the conspiracy, with prosecutors reading aloud the couple's online messages, which laid out their entire murderous plan. The court heard how she had bragged to friends that her boyfriend was a werewolf and that she, too, would soon join his pack. Jeremy Steinke was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Jasmine was also found guilty on all 3 counts. Due to her age, she received the maximum possible sentence for a youth offender in Canada, 10 years. Her sentence included 4 years in a psychiatric institution, followed by years of conditional supervision in the community. But the most controversial chapter of this story is what happened next. In 2016, after a decade of intensive therapy, rehabilitation, and a phased re-entry into society, Jasmine Richardson was declared a free woman. At the age of 22, the girl who had slaughtered her own family walked out of the justice system with a new, secret identity. She has reportedly attended university and now lives a quiet, anonymous life somewhere in Canada, her monstrous past completely hidden from the people around her. As of Wednesday, August 27th, 2025, Jasmine Richardson is in her early 30s. Her case remains one of the most disturbing and debated in criminal history, forcing society to grapple with an impossible question. Can a child who commits such an evil act ever be truly rehabilitated? For the community of Medicine Hat and the family of Mark, Deborah, and Jacob Richardson, the answer may never bring peace. When a teenager commits the unthinkable act of killing their own parent, we expect to see a panicked escape, a tearful confession, or a desperate, clumsy cover-up. But what if there is no panic at all? What if, after murdering her father in cold blood, a teenage girl simply throws a party? What happens when a gruesome crime scene becomes the backdrop for a month-long celebration, fueled by the victim's own money, while his body decomposes just feet away in a plastic bin? In 2014, Michael Howell, a former sports editor for the Columbia County News-Times in Georgia, was trying to build a new life for himself and his 17-year-old daughter, Crystal. He had recently purchased a remote, rustic cabin nestled in the mountains of Maggie Valley, North Carolina. It was supposed to be a peaceful sanctuary, a fresh start away from past troubles. But the quiet seclusion of the mountain home would soon become the setting for a crime defined by its almost unbelievable callousness, a crime that would reveal a chilling void where a daughter's love should have been. The relationship between father and daughter was strained, and on the morning of February 24th, 2014, that strain snapped. While Michael was passed out after taking a shower, Crystal made a horrifying decision. She walked to his gun case, retrieved his shotgun, and shot him once in the head at point-blank range, ending his life in an instant. But the murder itself was only the prelude to Crystal Howell's truly monstrous and bizarre story. Instead of fleeing or calling the police, her first act was to begin the systematic erasure of her father from his own life. She dragged his body through the house, leaving a bloody trail, and with considerable effort, managed to stuff his corpse into a plastic storage container. She then hauled the container out to a shed on the property and left it there. With the gruesome evidence of her crime tucked away, she didn't run. She didn't hide. She moved in her friends. For the next month, the cabin where Michael Howell had been murdered became a non-stop party house. Crystal immediately began spending her father's money with a chilling sense of entitlement. She had his prized Land Cruiser repainted and installed a new high-end stereo system. She invited her friends to come live with her, and the once quiet home descended into a chaotic scene of drugs, alcohol, and loud music. All the while, her father's body lay just outside, decomposing in its plastic tomb, the foul odor growing stronger by the day. She expertly deceived her out-of-state family with a web of calculated lies. She called her mother in Georgia and told her a fabricated story, that her father had taken his own life and that she, in her overwhelming grief, had buried him in the woods. She played the part of the distraught, traumatized daughter, a performance so convincing that her family had no reason to suspect the horrifying truth. Her chilling deception finally began to crumble in late March, a full month after the murder. Two of her friends, who had been staying at the cabin, decided they needed to move a large pinball machine into the shed. As they tried to make room, their attention was drawn to the large, heavy plastic bin and the overpowering stench emanating from it. Their curiosity turned to horror when they opened the lid. The sight and smell of Michael Howell's decomposing body sent them running to the authorities. By the time police were notified, Crystal was already gone. Knowing her gruesome secret was about to be exposed, she had packed her bags and fled. After a 2-day manhunt, she was found back in her home state of Georgia and arrested. During her confession, she told investigators a story that was almost as bizarre and disturbing as the crime itself. She claimed she had killed her father because she was angry. He was planning to sell the family's pet pig, a pig she had grown attached to and considered her own. This shockingly trivial and almost childish reason was the only motive she ever offered for committing parricide. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence, Crystal Brooke Howell pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and concealing a death, a deal that allowed her to avoid a lengthy and harrowing public trial. In 2016, a judge sentenced her to a minimum of 30 years in prison. During her sentencing, she gave a brief, tearful apology to her family, a stark contrast to the month of casual indifference she displayed while parting just feet from her father's dead body. As of Wednesday, August 27, 2025, Crystal Brooke Howell is incarcerated at the Anson Correctional Institution for Women in North Carolina. She will not be eligible for parole until she is in her late 40s. Her case remains a deeply disturbing look into a mind capable of not only brutal violence, but of a chilling, almost sociopathic detachment from the horror of her own actions. She didn't just murder her father, she erased him, then danced on his grave for a month, a final, grotesque act of disrespect that is almost impossible to comprehend. She was an aspiring horror writer who filled her blog with graphic tales of gore, death, and demonic figures, earning her thousands of online followers who knew her only as Vamp Chick. She was also, by her own account, a prisoner in her own home, the silent victim of years of horrific abuse. So, when 17-year-old Ashley Martinson shot her stepfather and brutally stabbed her mother to death, was it the act of a cold-blooded killer finally living out her dark literary fantasies, or was it the desperate, final cry of a victim who saw no other way out? From the outside, Ashley Martinson's life in the small, rural town of Peel, Wisconsin, was unremarkable. But online, she had crafted a dark and dramatic identity. On her blog and through social media, she wrote violent, horror-themed fiction and poetry, often featuring themes of murder, mutilation, and suffering. To the prosecution, this digital trail was a clear window into the mind of a calculating, premeditated killer, a girl who romanticized violence long before she ever picked up a weapon. But her defense attorneys, and Ashley herself, would tell a very different story. They claimed her writing was not a fantasy, but a desperate escape from a horrifying reality. According to Ashley, her home life was a living hell. She alleged that her stepfather, 37-year-old Thomas Ayres, was a violent and controlling tyrant who subjected her to years of physical and psychological abuse. She claimed he would lock her in her room for days at a time, berate her constantly, and had been physically abusive to her and her mother. Her mother, 40-year-old Jennifer Ayres, she said, was a passive and neglectful figure who did nothing to protect her from the abuse. In the days leading up to the murders, the tension in the house had reached a boiling point. On the night of March 7, 2015, that tension exploded. According to Ashley's testimony, an argument with her stepfather escalated into a violent rage. He was screaming at her, and in a moment of terror, she grabbed his shotgun. She shot him once in the head, and as he lay dying, she shot him again. Moments later, her mother entered the room. Ashley, armed with a knife, then turned on her, stabbing her more than 30 times. After the brutal slayings, her actions became even more bizarre. She went to the room where her 3 younger half-sisters, all under the age of 10, were hiding. But instead of harming them, she packed them a bag of snacks, put on a movie for them, and wrote them a note, telling them not to come out of the room because there had been a terrible accident. "I'm sorry," the note read. "I love you guys." She then locked them in the room, called her boyfriend, 22-year-old Ryan Sisko, and fled the state, leaving her sisters alone in a house with 2 dead bodies. The alarm was raised the next day when police received a 911 call from the house. One of the young girls had managed to get out of the room and call for help. A manhunt was immediately launched, and Ashley and her boyfriend were tracked and arrested in Indiana the following day. The case immediately drew national attention, and the public was presented with 2 irreconcilable portraits of Ashley Martinson. The prosecution painted her as a manipulative and bloodthirsty killer. They used her own words against her, presenting her violent blog posts and horror stories as evidence that she had been fantasizing about murder for years. They argued that the crime was not a spontaneous act of self-defense, but a premeditated execution, carried out by a young woman obsessed with death. The defense, however, argued that her actions were the tragic but inevitable result of a lifetime of trauma. They presented evidence and testimony about the abusive and toxic environment within the home, arguing that Ashley had snapped, a victim of battered person syndrome who truly believed she was about to be killed. Her violent writings, they contended, were not a blueprint for murder, but a desperate coping mechanism, a way for a terrified girl to process the horror of her daily life. Faced with the risk of a first-degree murder conviction and a mandatory life sentence, Ashley Martinson accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree intentional homicide. At her sentencing, the judge acknowledged the compelling evidence of abuse in her past, but made it clear that the sheer brutality of the murders required a substantial punishment. In 2016, she was sentenced to 23 years in prison, to be followed by 17 years of extended supervision. As of Wednesday, August 27, 2025, Ashley Martinson is incarcerated at the Taichida Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. She will be eligible for parole in her late 30s. Her case remains a dark and complicated puzzle, a chilling story that forces us to question the very nature of victimhood and culpability. Was she a monster who used a tragic past as an excuse, or was she a victim who became a monster? It's a question the justice system answered with a prison sentence, but one that the court of public opinion continues to debate. An intense teenage friendship can feel like its own secret universe, a private world built on shared dreams, inside jokes, and a language no one else can understand. But what happens when that world becomes more real, more important than reality itself? What if 2 brilliant, imaginative, and deeply obsessive girls become so lost in their shared fantasy that they decide the only way to protect it is to brutally murder the one person who threatens to tear them apart? In the conservative, post-war city of Christchurch, New Zealand, in the early 1950s, Pauline Parker and Juliet Hume were 2 lonely, intelligent outcasts who found in each other a kindred spirit. Pauline was the daughter of working-class parents, a brooding and intense girl who felt suffocated by her mundane life. Juliet was the sophisticated, charismatic daughter of a prominent university rector, but a childhood of chronic illness had left her feeling isolated. When they met at school, their connection was immediate and electric. They bonded over their shared health struggles and their mutual disdain for the ordinary world around them. Together, they began to build a new one. They called it the Fourth World. It was an elaborate, shared fantasy kingdom, a celestial paradise with its own royal family, its own religion, and its own moral code that superseded the laws of man. They were the creators and the rulers of this imaginary realm, documenting their adventures in hundreds of detailed diary entries, poems, and novel manuscripts. This fantasy world became their ultimate refuge, a place where their bond was secret and their brilliance was celebrated. They began to believe that they were geniuses, elevated above the common people around them, especially their own families, who they saw as dull and restrictive. Their relationship became all-consuming. They were inseparable, and the line between their fantasy and reality began to blur, that the real world was about to intrude in the most devastating way possible. Juliet's parents announced they were divorcing, and that Juliet would be sent to live with relatives in South Africa. For the two girls, this was an apocalyptic event. The thought of being separated was unbearable. They devised a plan for Pauline to go with Juliet, but there was one major obstacle: Pauline's mother, Honora Parker. Honora was a simple, kind woman who was deeply concerned by her daughter's obsessive and, in her view, unhealthy relationship with Juliet. She absolutely refused to allow Pauline to leave the country. In the girls' fantasy-addled minds, Honora was not a concerned mother. She was a villain, the primary antagonist in their life story, the one person who stood in the way of their eternal happiness in the Fourth World. And so, in their diaries, they began to plan her death with the same creative fervor they applied to their fantasy novels. Pauline wrote to her diary just days before the murder, "We have worked it out. We are both thrilled with the idea. Naturally, we feel a trifle nervy, but the pleasure of anticipation is great." On the afternoon of June 22, 1954, the plan was put into action. The two girls took Honora for a walk in the beautiful and secluded Victoria Park. In a bag Pauline carried, there was a half-brick, wrapped inside an old stocking. When they reached a remote wooded part of the path, they made their move. Juliet dropped a small, decorative stone. When Honora bent down to pick it up, Pauline struck her in the head with the brick-filled stocking. What followed was an act of shocking, frenzied brutality. The two teenagers bludgeoned Honora Parker to death, striking her more than 45 times. After the murder, they ran, covered in blood, to a nearby tea kiosk, screaming for help. They told a frantic, fabricated story about how Pauline's mother had slipped on the path, fallen, and tragically hit her head. But their story fell apart almost immediately. The sheer number and violence of Honora's head wounds were utterly inconsistent with a simple fall. Police found the blood-soaked murder weapon nearby, and most damningly of all, they discovered the girls' diaries, which provided a chilling, real-time chronicle of their shared psychosis and their growing plot to kill. The trial became a global sensation, scandalizing New Zealand with its details of teenage obsession, fantasy, and murder. Because they were only 15 and 16, they were too young for the death penalty. In the end, they were found guilty of murder and sentenced to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure. They served just 5 years each in separate prisons, and a condition of their release was that they were never to contact each other again. But the story has one final, unbelievable twist. After her release, Juliet Hulme moved to England, changed her name to Anne Perry, and, in a truly surreal turn of events, became a world-renowned, best-selling author of historical detective novels. For decades, her dark past remained a secret until it was exposed by journalists around the time Peter Jackson's acclaimed 1994 film about the case, Heavenly Creatures, was released. As of Wednesday, August 27, 2025, both women are in their late 80s. Pauline Parker, after her release, lived a quiet, reclusive life. Juliet Hulme, as Anne Perry, became a literary star, and millions of fans completely unaware that the woman writing their favorite murder mysteries was herself a real-life killer. Their story remains one of the most fascinating and disturbing psychological case studies of the 20th century, a timeless reminder of how a friendship, when twisted by obsession, can create a private world so powerful it's worth killing for. A teenager's phone is their private universe, a hidden world of secret chats, inside jokes, and coded conversations. But what if that world turns deadly? What if, in between emojis and selfies, a 14-year-old girl is meticulously planning the murder of her own mother with a soldier she met online, leaving a digital blueprint of her crime, one chilling text message at a time? In 2015, Jaime Silvonek was a freshman at a Catholic high school in Allentown, Pennsylvania. To the outside world, she was a typical suburban teenager, living in a comfortable home with her mother, 54-year-old Cheryl Silvonek. But secretly, on social media apps, Jaime was living a double life. She had cultivated an intense and illegal online relationship with 20-year-old Caleb Barnes, an active-duty Army soldier stationed at Fort Meade, Maryland. Their relationship was a whirlwind of digital communication, a secret world that soon collided with reality. When Cheryl discovered the relationship, she was horrified. She saw a 20-year-old man preying on her 14-year-old daughter. She did what any concerned parent would do. She forbade Jaime from seeing him and threatened to go to the police and have him charged with statutory rape. In Jaime's mind, her mother was not a protector. She was an obstacle that, in the cold, transactional language of her text messages with Barnes, needed to be permanently removed. The digital trail they left behind is one of the most disturbing in the annals of true crime. Over thousands of text messages, investigators would later uncover a real-time chronicle of a murder plot. Jaime, the 14-year-old, was not a passive victim of manipulation. She was an active and often eager participant in the conspiracy. When Barnes suggested that Cheryl might magically disappear, Jaime responded enthusiastically. She wrote, "I want her gone." She and Barnes discussed methods, alibis, and the disposal of the body with a chilling, almost casual detachment. Jaime provided him with a detailed diagram of her house and even suggested using a knife to avoid the noise of a gunshot. She texted him, "Just do it." On the night of March 15, 2015, the digital plot became a brutal reality. In a tragic attempt to placate her daughter, Cheryl had agreed to drive Jaime and Caleb Barnes home from a concert in Scranton. As she pulled into the driveway of their suburban home, Barnes, who was sitting in the back seat, lunged forward and began to brutally stab her. As her mother was being murdered just inches away from her, Jaime Silvonek sat in the front passenger seat and watched. After the killing, the two teenagers attempted a clumsy and panicked cover-up. They drove Cheryl's car to a remote wooded area and tried to bury her body in a shallow, snowy grave. They cleaned the blood from the car with bleach and went back to the house. The next morning, Jaime called the police and reported her mother missing, playing the part of the worried daughter. But their digital footprints were too loud, too clear. Police quickly identified Barnes as a person of interest, and the thousands of incriminating text messages sealed their fate. Both were arrested and charged as adults with first-degree murder. The legal battle that followed was a war of conflicting narratives. Who was the true mastermind? Jaime's defense team portrayed her as a deeply troubled and impressionable young girl who had been groomed and manipulated by an older, predatory soldier. They argued that she was a child caught in a toxic relationship who was not mature enough to understand the consequences of her actions. Barnes's defense, however, painted a very different picture. They claimed that Jaime was the cold, calculating, and manipulative force behind the entire plot. A sociopathic teenager who had relentlessly pushed him to kill the mother she had grown to hate. Faced with a mountain of her own words in the form of thousands of texts, Jaime Silvonek ultimately accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in exchange for a sentence of 35 years to life. A key condition of her plea was that she had to testify against Caleb Barnes. At his trial, she took the stand and, in a quiet, unemotional voice, detailed her role in planning her mother's murder. Her testimony helped secure a conviction, and Caleb Barnes was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As of Wednesday, August 27, 2025, Jaime Silvonek is incarcerated at SCI Muncie, a state correctional institution in Pennsylvania. She will not be eligible for parole until she is 49 years old. Her case is a terrifying cautionary tale for the digital age, a story of how a secret online world can foster a deadly conspiracy, and how a teenager's words, typed into the cold glow of a phone screen, can become the chilling and undeniable evidence of murder. Teenage rebellion is a tale as old as time. Arguments over curfews, fights over forbidden relationships, and the desperate, all-consuming desire for freedom. But what happens when that desire turns deadly? What if, to a 16-year-old girl living a life of privilege, the ultimate prize, being with her boyfriend and inheriting her parents' fortune, is worth the ultimate price, their lives? In the affluent resort town of Bellevue, Idaho, the Johnson family seemed to have it all. Alan and Diane Johnson were successful business owners, living in a beautiful home with their 16-year-old daughter, Sarah. Sarah was given everything a teenager could want: a car, nice clothes, and financial freedom. But behind the facade of wealth and success, the Johnson home was a battleground. The war was over Sarah's boyfriend, 19-year-old Bruno Santos. Her parents vehemently disapproved of the relationship, citing his age and what they perceived as a bad influence on their daughter. The arguments were constant, the tension escalating daily. By the summer of 2003, Alan and Diane had reached their breaking point. They delivered an ultimatum: end the relationship, or they would send her away. When Sarah refused, they made good on their threat, enrolling her in a boarding school out of state. Her departure date was set for the morning of September 2nd. For Sarah Johnson, this was not just a punishment, it was a deadline. In the pre-dawn darkness of that very morning, just hours before she was scheduled to leave, Sarah made a horrifying choice. She went to her father's guest house, retrieved his high-powered Winchester hunting rifle, and crept back into the main house. She went to her mother's bedroom first. As 52-year-old Diane Johnson slept, her daughter raised the rifle and shot her in the head, killing her instantly. Sarah then walked down the hall to the master bedroom, where her 46-year-old father Alan was sleeping. She aimed the powerful weapon at his chest and fired, the gunshot echoing through the silent, cavernous house. The next move was a cold, calculated performance. She threw the murder weapon in the bushes outside and ran to a neighbor's house, playing the part of the hysterical, traumatized survivor. She claimed she had been in the shower when she heard gunshots and discovered her parents' bodies, suggesting an intruder was responsible. But her story began to unravel almost immediately. Investigators arriving at the sprawling 3,600 square foot home found a crime scene that told a very different tale. There were no signs of forced entry. No valuables had been stolen. The evidence did not point to a random home invasion, but to something far more intimate and sinister. The true breakthrough came when detectives, searching the property, looked in the garbage can outside. Inside, they found a bloody pink bathrobe and a single, discarded latex glove. The DNA on the glove and the blood spatter on the robe belonged to Sarah and her parents. It was the smoking gun that directly linked the grieving daughter to the brutal executions. The trial of Sarah Johnson in 2005 captivated the state of Idaho. The prosecution built their case on the powerful combination of motive and physical evidence. They argued that Sarah, faced with being separated from her boyfriend, had committed a cold and calculated double murder to gain her freedom and, in the process, inherit her parents' substantial estate, which was worth millions. They portrayed her as a spoiled, remorseless killer who saw her own parents as nothing more than obstacles to be removed. The defense scrambled to create an alternative theory, attempting to cast suspicion on a handyman or even her boyfriend, but they could not overcome the damning forensic evidence. The bloody robe and the glove were irrefutable. After a 6-week trial, the jury deliberated for just over 10 hours before finding Sarah Johnson guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Because she was 16 at the time of the crime, she was spared the death penalty, but the judge sentenced her to 2 concurrent life sentences without the possibility of parole. However, her legal journey was not over. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court made a landmark ruling in the case of Miller versus Alabama, declaring that mandatory life without hyphen parole sentences for juvenile offenders were unconstitutional. This decision gave Sarah Johnson a second chance. Her case was sent back for a new sentencing hearing. In 2021, after hearing arguments from both sides, the judge once again handed down the same sentence, 2 concurrent terms of life in prison. He noted that her crimes demonstrated an utter callousness and that she still posed a risk, showing a lack of empathy and remorse that suggested she was beyond rehabilitation. As of Wednesday, August 27, 2025, Sarah Johnson remains incarcerated at the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center in Idaho. She continues to maintain her innocence. Her case is a chilling portrait of teenage entitlement twisted into homicidal rage, a story of a girl who had everything but decided that everything wasn't enough, trading her family's lives for a fantasy of freedom that would land her in a prison cell for the rest of her life. A child is taught to trust their father, to see him as their ultimate protector, their moral compass in a confusing world. But what if that protector is a master manipulator? What happens when a father consumed by greed and lust convinces his 14-year-old daughter that the only way to save their family is for her to sneak into a bedroom in the middle of the night and murder her own stepmother? In the affluent suburbs of Garden Grove, California, David Brown was a charismatic and successful computer businessman who appeared to have the perfect life. He lived in a beautiful home with his 5th wife, 23-year-old Linda, and his 14-year-old daughter from a previous marriage, Cinnamon. To the outside world, they were a modern, blended family. But David Brown was a narcissistic sociopath, a puppet master who controlled his family through a complex web of lies, fear, and manipulation. And at the center of that web were 2 teenage girls, his daughter, Cinnamon, and Linda's own younger sister, 17-year-old Patty Bailey, who was living with the family and was secretly David's mistress. David wanted his wife Linda dead. She had a life insurance policy worth nearly $1 million, and her death would free him to be with his teenage lover, Patty. But he was too clever to do the dirty work himself. Instead, he began a campaign of systematic psychological torture against his own daughter. For months, he brainwashed Cinnamon, feeding her a terrifying narrative that her stepmother, Linda, was an evil woman who was planning to kill him. He convinced the impressionable 14-year-old that she was the only one who could save him, that it was her sacred duty to act first. He was not just her father, he was her handler, turning his own child into a programmable assassin. On the night of March 19, 1985, David Brown put his monstrous plan into motion. Following her father's detailed instructions, Cinnamon took a handgun, crept into the bedroom where her stepmother Linda was sleeping, and shot her twice, killing her. But the plan didn't end with the murder. David had devised a cruel second act, designed to paint Cinnamon as a tragic, emotionally disturbed victim. He forced her to take an overdose of pills to make it look like a suicide attempt, wrote a desperate note, and then tied her up in a dog kennel in the backyard to be discovered. The initial deception worked perfectly. The police and the public saw the case just as David had designed it. A tragic story of a young, abused girl who had snapped and killed her wicked stepmother before trying to take her own life. Cinnamon, playing the part her father had assigned her, confessed. She was convicted of murder and sentenced to 24 years to life in a juvenile facility. David Brown, the grieving husband and father, was free to collect the insurance money and continue his affair with his dead wife's sister. He had committed the perfect proxy murder. But one person never believed the story: Linda's father. He knew his daughter wasn't the monster David had described, and he relentlessly pushed for investigators to look deeper. The true breakthrough, however, came from Cinnamon herself. While in custody, she began to slowly and cautiously confide in a probation officer and her aunt, hinting that there was more to the story. Sensing an opportunity, the district attorney's office orchestrated a daring plan. Cinnamon's aunt agreed to wear a wire during her visits. In a series of secretly recorded conversations, the full, horrifying truth came pouring out. Cinnamon confessed that her father had orchestrated the entire plot, from the months of brainwashing to the final, fatal instructions. Armed with this explosive confession, investigators reopened the case, now focusing on David Brown as the mastermind. In 1988, David Brown and his mistress, Patty Bailey, were arrested. The trial that followed was a sensational saga of greed, incest, and manipulation. The star witness against David was his own daughter, Cinnamon. In a dramatic courtroom confrontation, she faced the father who had turned her into a killer and told the world the truth. In 1990, David Brown was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His mistress, Patty Bailey, was also convicted for her role in the conspiracy. Cinnamon Brown, for her cooperation, was released from custody in 1992 after serving just 7 years. As of Wednesday, August 27, 2025, Cinnamon Brown, now in her 50s, lives a quiet life under a new identity. She has married, had children, and has spent her life trying to escape the shadow of the father who stole her innocence and turned her into a weapon. David Brown died in prison in 2014, a convicted puppet master who remains one of the most chilling examples of a truly evil father in American crime history. You have almost certainly seen the video. A teenage girl in an orange jumpsuit stands before a judge, smiling, pointing to her eyes, and coolly preening for the camera as the horrific details of her crime are read aloud. The clip went viral, remixed and shared across TikTok and YouTube, becoming a meme of defiant, almost glamorous evil set to pop songs. But what if the smile wasn't a sign of evil, but of madness? What if, behind the face that launched a million memes, was a mind so completely shattered by psychosis that she didn't even understand she had just brutally murdered her own mother? In the months leading up to August 2013, the once loving relationship between 18-year-old Isabella Guzman and her 47-year-old mother, Uni Hoy, had completely disintegrated. Living in a quiet suburban home in Aurora, Colorado, the two were locked in a constant and escalating war. Isabella, who had been a Jehovah's Witness, had recently quit the religion, a decision that created immense friction with her devout mother. The arguments grew more frequent and more hostile. Isabella became defiant and threatening, spitting in her mother's face and sending her increasingly menacing emails. The tension became so unbearable that Yumi grew genuinely terrified of her own daughter. She told her second husband, Ryan Hoy, that she was scared, and she even called the police to the home just days before the murder, trying to find a way to manage Isabella's frightening behavior. This was not simply a case of teenage rebellion. It was the terrifying and rapid onset of a severe mental illness. Unbeknownst to her family, who saw her actions as willful defiance, Isabella was descending into a profound, paranoid schizophrenia. Her reality was fracturing, being replaced by a terrifying world of dark delusions. Her mind convinced her that the woman she called her mother was not her mother at all, but an evil entity named Cecilia that had taken her place. In her completely broken mind, killing this imposter was not a crime. It was a righteous and necessary mission to save the world from an impending evil. The day of the murder, she sent her mother a chillingly simple email that read, "You will pay." On the evening of August 28, 2013, that mission reached its horrifying and tragic conclusion. Isabella waited for her mother to go upstairs for a shower. Her stepfather, Ryan Hoy, was downstairs eating when he heard a thud from the bathroom above, followed by his wife calling his name. He rushed upstairs to find the bathroom door locked. As he pounded on the door, he could hear the shower still running and a struggle ensuing inside. He ran back downstairs to call 911, and when he returned, the terrifying sounds had stopped. The door opened, and Isabella walked out, silent and holding a long knife. She stared blankly past him, walked down the stairs, and calmly left the house. Ryan Hoy pushed the bathroom door open and discovered his wife's lifeless body in a scene of absolute horror. She had been stabbed 151 times. Isabella fled, sparking a manhunt. She was found the next day, hiding in a nearby parking garage, and was arrested without incident. It was at her subsequent court appearance that the now infamous video was filmed. As a judge detailed the charges against her, Isabella stared at the cameras, smiled, made strange faces, and seemed completely detached from the gravity of the situation. The internet saw a cold, remorseless killer and created a viral sensation. But mental health experts saw something else entirely. A young woman in the clear and undeniable grips of a powerful, active psychosis. Isabella was sent to the Colorado Mental Health Institute for an extensive psychiatric evaluation. The diagnosis from multiple doctors was unanimous and unequivocal. She was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. Their reports detailed her profound delusions, her auditory hallucinations, and her complete inability to distinguish fantasy from reality at the time of a crime. They concluded that she was legally insane, incapable of understanding that her actions were wrong, because, in her shattered reality, she believed she was fighting a righteous battle against an evil being. Based on this overwhelming psychiatric evidence, the court accepted her plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. She was not sent to prison. Instead, she was committed indefinitely to the state mental hospital in Pueblo, where she would undergo years of intensive treatment with powerful antipsychotic medications. Years later, in 2020, her case resurfaced when she sought to be granted off-grounds privileges, claiming in a virtual interview that she was no longer a threat. Speaking with a calm clarity that was a world away from the girl in the viral video, she said, "I was not myself when I did that. I have my diagnosis under control. I'm not mentally ill anymore. I'm not a danger to anyone." Her request was ultimately denied, with the court ruling that she still needed to be monitored within the confines of the hospital. As of Wednesday, August 27th, 2025, Isabella Guzman remains a patient at the Colorado Mental Health Institute. The viral meme of the sweet but psycho girl is a shallow and deeply misleading snapshot of a much more complex and terrifying tragedy. Her story is not one of calculated evil, but of a catastrophic mental health crisis that erupted into unimaginable violence, leaving a family destroyed and forcing the public to confront the terrifying and often misunderstood nature of severe mental illness. For many immigrant parents, the dream is a perfect child, a straight A student, a gifted musician, a respectful daughter who will achieve the success they sacrificed everything for. But what happens when the pressure to maintain that perfect image becomes a suffocating, unbearable lie? What if, to protect that lie and be with a forbidden lover, a daughter decides the only solution is to hire hitmen to execute the very parents who demanded her perfection in the first place? To her strict and demanding Vietnamese parents, Han and Bicha Pan, Jennifer Pan was the golden child. Living in a quiet suburb of Toronto, Canada, she was the embodiment of the immigrant dream, By her early 20s, she was, by her own account, an award-winning figure skater, a talented pianist, and a star pharmacology student at a prestigious university. Her parents were immensely proud, seeing their own sacrifices reflected in their daughter's incredible success. But the entire story, every award, every report card, every university acceptance letter, was an intricate and deeply pathological lie. The reality was that Jennifer Pan was an average student who had begun failing classes in high school. The pressure to live up to her father's impossibly high expectations was so intense that instead of admitting failure, she began to build a fantasy life. For nearly a decade, she lived a stunning double life. She forged report cards, filled notebooks with fake lecture notes, and pretended to attend university classes every day. In reality, she would go to the public library or sit in cafes, killing time until she could return home and continue the charade. She was living in a prison of her own making, terrified of the day her father would discover the truth. The catalyst for the horrifying events to come was her secret, long-term relationship with her high school boyfriend, Daniel Wong. Her parents fiercely disapproved of him, seeing him as a drug-dealing distraction from her studies. They gave her an ultimatum, him or her family. For a time, she tried to appease them, but the lies and the pressure were becoming too much to bear. When her parents finally discovered part of her deception, that she was not living with a friend near campus, but secretly with Daniel's family, they brought her home and placed her under a virtual house arrest. They took her phone and her laptop, forbidding her from ever seeing Daniel again. It was in this suffocating environment that a new, monstrous plan took shape. Jennifer reconnected with Daniel, and together they decided there was only one way out. They began to plot the murder of her parents. The motive was a twisted combination of a desire for freedom, revenge for their forced breakup, and greed. They believed she would inherit an estimated $500,000. They used a contact of Daniel's to hire 3 hitmen. The plan was meticulously designed to look like a robbery gone wrong, a random act of violence that would leave Jennifer as the sole, traumatized survivor. On the night of November 8, 2010, the plan was put into motion. After her father went to bed, Jennifer unlocked the front door of the family home. Just after 10 p.m., the 3 hitmen entered, armed with guns. They tied Jennifer up, seemingly as part of the test. Robbery, a performance for which she had practiced. They then took her parents down to the basement, put blankets over their heads, and shot them. Her mother, Bish Ha, was killed instantly. Her father, Han, was shot in the face and shoulder. Believing both were dead, the hitman took the cash from the house and fled, leaving Jennifer tied up upstairs to be discovered as the innocent victim. But the perfect murder plot had one fatal flaw. Han Pan survived. Despite being shot in the face, he drifted in and out of consciousness, and when he heard his daughter speaking softly with one of the men as they left, he knew something was terribly wrong. He managed to free himself, crawl upstairs, and escape to a neighbor's house to call for help. When police interviewed Jennifer at the station, she delivered a flawless performance as the hysterical, grieving daughter. But her story collapsed the moment her father woke from a medically induced coma. His testimony was devastating. He told police that his own daughter was not a victim. She had been walking around the house untied, speaking in a familiar, friendly tone with the killers. She was an accomplice. Armed with this shocking betrayal, investigators broke Jennifer's story. Her web of lies about her education, her secret life, and her role in the murder plot all came undone. She and her co-conspirators, including Daniel Wong, were arrested and charged with first-degree murder and attempted murder. In 2014, after a lengthy trial that captivated the country, Jennifer Pan was found guilty. She was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. As of Wednesday, August 27, 2025, Jennifer Pan is incarcerated at the Grand Valley Institution for Women in Ontario, Canada. In 2023, a court granted her a new trial for the first-degree murder conviction due to a legal error in the judge's instructions to the jury, though she remains in prison. Her case is a horrifying and tragic study of the devastating consequences of parental pressure and a daughter's decade-long deception, a reminder that the desperate need to maintain a lie can be a motive as powerful and as deadly as any other. From forbidden love and chilling greed to shared psychosis and online conspiracies, the stories of these teenage girls reveal the terrifying and complex ways a child can turn on their own parent. They are a haunting reminder that the most devastating evil can sometimes wear the most innocent face. If you found this exploration into these shocking cases compelling, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Which of these cases did you find the most shocking? Share your thoughts in the comments below.